The book of 1 Chronicles opens differently from most books in the Bible. It begins not with stories, but with genealogies chapter after chapter of names tracing the lineage of God's people from Adam to the time of King David. At first glance, this long list may seem tedious, but it carries deep meaning. These genealogies show that God remembers people, families, and promises. Every name matters to him. They are not just historical records, they are reminders of covenant, identity, and legacy. 1 Chronicles was written after the Babylonian exile to help a returning generation reconnect with their heritage and understand their spiritual foundation. It reminds them that, no matter how scattered or broken the past may seem, God's redemptive plan continues. After the genealogies, the narrative shifts in chapter 10, beginning with the death of King Saul. Unlike 1 Samuel, which tells more about Saul's life, 1 Chronicles gives a brief summary focusing on his failure to obey God and consult the Lord. This sets up a contrast. The fall of man's choice versus the rise of God's choice. The chronicler wants us to see clearly that disobedience leads to ruin, and that leadership must be rooted in submission to God. From chapter 11 onward, the focus is entirely on David, not his failures, but his victories, leadership, and heart for God. This emphasis is intentional. While 2 Samuel includes David's sins, 1 Chronicles highlights his role as God's chosen king, a man after God's heart who united the nation and prepared the way for true worship. It's a reminder that our legacy is not defined by our worst moments, but by our pursuit of God's purpose. One of David's first major acts is to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. The Ark represents God's presence, and David desires to place God at the center of the nation. But the first attempt fails when Uzzah touches the Ark and dies. David is shaken, but he learns that worship must be done according to God's instructions, not human ideas. This teaches us that reverence and obedience matter deeply when approaching the holy things of God. Later, when the ark is brought successfully into Jerusalem, David dances before the Lord with all his might, wearing a simple priestly garment. This scene paints a vivid picture of authentic worship, joyful, humble, and passionate. David institutes worship leaders, musicians, and daily praise, making Jerusalem not just a political capital, but a spiritual center. His example reminds us that leaders must lead in worship, not just governance. In 1 Chronicles 17, David expresses a desire to build a temple for God. But God responds with a surprising message. David will not build the house. His son will. Instead, God makes a covenant with David, promising that his throne will be established forever. This is known as the Davidic covenant, and it points directly to Jesus Christ, the eternal king from David's line. This moment reveals a critical teaching. Sometimes our greatest legacy is what we prepare, not what we personally complete. David doesn't teep out or complain when God says no. He gets to work preparing everything for the temple. Chapters 22 to 29 are filled with David gathering materials, assigning Levites, and organizing the priesthood. He even hands over the blueprints to Solomon. This shows David's maturity and vision. He knows that God's work is bigger than any one person, and that serving the next generation is part of kingdom leadership. 1 Chronicles also emphasizes the importance of worship structure. David establishes 24 divisions of priests and singers, showing that worship is not random, it's ordered, intentional, and continuous. These organizational structures reflect heaven itself, where worship never stops. God desires a people who worship him in excellence and consistency. In chapter 28, David gives a final speech to Israel and Solomon. He reminds them of God's faithfulness, calls them to wholehearted obedience, and charges Solomon to seek God, serve him with a willing heart, and not be afraid. David's words echo across time. Be strong and courageous, and do it. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. This is the heartbeat of 1 Chronicles scourge rooted in God's presence and faithfulness. The book closes in chapter 29 with a grand assembly where the people willingly give offerings for the temple. The entire nation joins in joyful generosity, and David offers a powerful public prayer. He acknowledges that everything they have comes from God, and praises him for his greatness and mercy. This is biblical stewardship at its finest, giving back to God with joyful hearts, knowing it all belongs to him anyway. Key teachings from 1 Chronicles. God values legacy and remembrance. The genealogies remind us that God sees every name and every family in his plan of redemption. Leadership must honor God above self. Saul failed by acting independently of God. David succeeded by making God central. Worship must be holy, joyful, and ordered. David teaches us that true worship blends passion, structure, and obedience. Your role in God's plan may be preparation, not completion. David didn't build the temple, but he empowered Solomon and left behind a vision. The presence of God is the priority. Bringing the ark to Jerusalem symbolizes that God must dwell among his people. Our giving and service reflect our hearts. The people's generous offerings show that revival often leads to sacrificial worship. God's promises extend beyond generations. The Davidic covenant finds its fulfillment in Jesus, the eternal King. Why 1 Chronicles still speaks today. 1 Chronicles is not just about ancient history at ease, about what kind of people and leaders God desires today. It challenges us to remember who we are, build for the future, worship with depth, and serve with excellence. In a world obsessed with instant results, 1 Chronicles reminds us that faithfulness over time leaves the greatest impact. This book also invites us to consider our spiritual legacy. What are we preparing for the next generation? Are we organizing our lives around worship and obedience? Are we generous, joyful, and God-centered in how we lead and give? David's life in 1 Chronicles isn't about perfection, it's about devotion, vision, and a heart fully yielded to God. And that's the kind of heart God still seeks today.